What if I told you that the most powerful nations in history didn't fall to their enemies? They fell to themselves. Look at this map of the world and think about where the superpowers were just a century ago. The British Empire stretched across continents. The Soviet Union controlled half of Europe, and yet both of them are gone. So what happened? What strategic decisions did these nations make that cost them everything? Let's start with the British Empire. At its peak in the late 1800s, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and population. They had the strongest navy, the most advanced economy, and seemingly unlimited power. But they made one critical strategic error that would eventually cost them everything. They overextended themselves. Think about it this way. Britain was trying to maintain control over India, Canada, Australia, Africa, and dozens of other territories all at the same time. The costs of maintaining this empire became astronomical. Military expenses skyrocketed. Administrative overhead consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. And here's what I mean by the real problem. They weren't investing in innovation and modernization at home. While they were pouring money into colonial administration, other nations like Germany and the United States were building new industries and technologies. Britain's share of global manufacturing actually dropped from 32% in 1870 to just 14% by 1913. That's a massive decline in just 4 decades. And this is where it gets interesting. Britain made another strategic mistake. They refused to adapt their naval strategy. The Royal Navy was built around battleships, massive ships that required enormous resources to build and maintain. But Germany and other nations were investing in submarines and newer technologies. Britain was so committed to their old way of doing things that they couldn't pivot fast enough. The First World War accelerated this decline dramatically. Britain spent enormous amounts of money and lost an entire generation of young men. The war left them economically exhausted. They had borrowed heavily from the United States to finance the conflict. By the time the war ended, Britain was no longer the world's creditor nation. They were a debtor nation. The United States had replaced them. So let me break this down for you. The British Empire's decline wasn't because they were invaded or defeated militarily in a decisive way. It was because they made strategic choices that weakened them from within. They overextended militarily. They failed to innovate economically. They clung to outdated strategies, and they exhausted their finances trying to maintain something that was becoming increasingly unsustainable. This is the pattern we're going to see repeated throughout history. Now, let's look at the Ottoman Empire. For nearly 600 years, the Ottoman Empire was one of the world's great superpowers. At its height, it controlled territory across 3 continents. They had a sophisticated military, a complex bureaucratic system, and significant cultural influence. But they made strategic decisions that led to their eventual collapse. The first major mistake was their failure to modernize their military. While European nations were developing gunpowder weapons and new military tactics, the Ottoman Empire continued to rely on traditional cavalry and outdated strategies. By the 1600s and 1700s, they were consistently losing battles to European powers. They had superior numbers, but inferior technology and tactics. Consider the Siege of Vienna in 1683. The Ottoman forces under Kara Mustafa Pasha were defeated by a coalition of European armies led by Polish King John III Sobieski. It marked the beginning of Ottoman territorial decline in Europe. They never recovered the lands they lost. The second mistake was economic. The Ottoman Empire relied heavily on trade routes. When European nations discovered sea routes to Asia and Africa, they bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. This meant the Ottoman Empire lost the trade revenue that had funded their government and military. They were making less money while their military expenses remained high. This created a budget crisis that they couldn't solve. The third strategic error was political. The Ottoman Empire became increasingly rigid and resistant to change. The government refused to implement reforms that might have modernized their system. They were so invested in the way things had always been done that they couldn't adapt to a changing world. By the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. Everyone could see they were declining. And here's the thing. It took until 1922 for the empire to finally collapse, but that decline had been happening for centuries. It was the result of strategic choices made generations earlier. This teaches us something crucial. Superpower decline isn't usually sudden. It's gradual. It happens because nations make strategic decisions that seem reasonable at the time, but have long-term consequences they don't anticipate. So here's what I want you to understand. If you're watching this, you need to hit that subscribe button, because we're covering patterns that are happening right now in our world today. These aren't just historical lessons. They're warnings about what's happening with current superpowers.
The strategies that led to decline in the past are the same strategies we need to watch for today.
So subscribe so you don't miss the next video, where we break down what this means for the world right now. Now, let's zoom out across the entire 20th century and look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union rose to superpower status after the Second World War. They had a massive military. They controlled half of Europe, and they were competing with the United States for global influence. But they made strategic decisions that ultimately led to their collapse in 1991. The first major mistake was economic. The Soviet system was built on central planning. The government tried to control every aspect of the economy. This might have worked for rapid industrialization in the early decades, but it created massive inefficiencies. Factories produced goods that nobody wanted. Resources were wasted on projects that didn't make sense. Innovation slowed to a crawl because there was no competition and no incentive to improve. Meanwhile, the United States was experiencing rapid technological innovation. American companies were developing computers, software, and new technologies at an incredible pace. The Soviet Union was falling further and further behind. By the 1980s, the technological gap had become enormous. American personal computers were becoming mainstream, while Soviet citizens couldn't access basic consumer electronics. The second strategic mistake was military overextension. The Soviet Union was spending an enormous percentage of their GDP on the military. Some estimates suggest they were spending 15 to 17% of their entire economic output on the military. Compare that to the United States, which was spending around 6%. The Soviet Union was trying to match American military spending while having a much smaller economy. This was unsustainable. They were draining resources from civilian sectors like healthcare, housing, and consumer goods. The Soviet people were getting poorer while the military got richer. The third mistake was geopolitical overreach. The Soviet Union was trying to spread their influence across the entire globe. They were supporting communist movements in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. They invaded Afghanistan in 1979, which turned into a quagmire that drained their resources for a decade. They were trying to be a global superpower while their economy was struggling. And here's the thing, this is exactly what happened to the British Empire. They overextended themselves militarily and economically, trying to maintain influence everywhere at once. When you spread yourself too thin, you become weak everywhere. The Soviet Union's decline accelerated in the 1980s. Their economy was stagnating. Their military was expensive and increasingly obsolete. Their political system was rigid and couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. By 1991, the Soviet Union simply collapsed. It happened remarkably quickly, but it was the result of strategic decisions made decades earlier. Let's talk about the United States. Now, before you get upset, hear me out. The United States is still the world's largest economy and has the most powerful military. But there are warning signs that we need to pay attention to. The first warning sign is military overextension. The United States has military bases in more than 150 countries around the world. They're involved in military operations across the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Europe. The annual defense budget is over $800 billion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. Now, defense spending isn't inherently bad, but when it becomes unsustainable relative to your economy, it becomes a problem. Think about what happened to previous superpowers. The Ottoman Empire spent so much on their military that they couldn't modernize their economy. The Soviet Union spent so much on their military that their civilian economy collapsed. This is the pattern we need to watch for. The second warning sign is economic challenges. The United States has a massive national debt. They're running huge budget deficits every single year. Infrastructure is aging and needs investment. Meanwhile, other nations are investing heavily in new technologies and infrastructure. China is building high-speed rail networks, investing in renewable energy, and modernizing their infrastructure. The United States is falling behind in some of these areas. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, the United States needs approximately $2.6 trillion in infrastructure investment by 2030 just to maintain current conditions. But the government isn't making that investment. Instead, money is going toward military spending and debt servicing. This is a counterintuitive problem because most people think of the United States as wealthy and powerful. But if you're not investing in your own infrastructure and innovation, you are actually weakening yourselves over time. The third warning sign is political polarization. The government is increasingly divided and unable to make long-term strategic decisions. This is different from the Ottoman Empire or the Soviet Union, but it's still a strategic vulnerability. When a government is divided against itself, it can't implement coherent long-term strategies. It can't adapt quickly to changing circumstances. So here's what I mean. The United States isn't in decline yet, but they're showing some of the early warning signs that we saw in previous superpowers, and this is where it gets interesting. They still have time to course correct. They still have the resources and the capability to make different strategic choices, but they need to recognize these warning signs and act on them. Now let's talk about China. China is rising as a superpower, but they're also facing strategic challenges. The first challenge is economic. China's economy is slowing down. They're facing demographic challenges with an aging population and fewer young people entering the workforce. Their real estate market is struggling. They have massive amounts of debt at the local government level. According to data from the International Monetary Fund, China's growth rate has slowed from double digits in the 2000s to around 5% in recent years. That's still respectable, but it's a significant slowdown. The second challenge is geopolitical. China is trying to expand their influence through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. They're building infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But this is expensive. Some of these projects aren't generating the returns they expected, and other nations are becoming wary of Chinese influence. They're worried about debt traps and loss of sovereignty. The third challenge is military. China is building up their military rapidly, but they're still behind the United States in many areas. They're trying to modernize their navy and develop advanced weapons systems. But this requires enormous resources. If China follows the path of previous superpowers, they could make the mistake of overextending themselves militarily while their economy struggles. They could end up like the Soviet Union, spending so much on the military that they can't invest in their economy and infrastructure. Here's why this matters today. We're living through a period where multiple superpowers are facing similar strategic challenges. The United States is struggling with overextension and economic challenges. China is facing economic slowdown while trying to expand militarily. Europe is dealing with its own economic and political challenges. The question isn't whether these powers will decline. The question is whether they'll recognize the warning signs and make different strategic choices. Will they invest in innovation and infrastructure at home? Will they reduce their military commitments in places where they don't have vital interests? Will they focus on making their own nations stronger rather than trying to dominate everywhere at once? These are the decisions that will determine whether we see a stable transition of power or a chaotic period of decline and conflict. So what's the big lesson here? Superpowers decline because they make strategic mistakes. They overextend themselves militarily. They fail to invest in innovation and modernization at home. They cling to outdated strategies and refuse to adapt. They drain their resources trying to maintain influence everywhere at once. And they often don't realize they're in decline until it's too late. But here's the hopeful part. These aren't inevitable. They can recognize the warning signs and change course. The United States could reduce military spending in some areas and invest more in infrastructure and innovation. China could focus on sustainable economic growth instead of rapid expansion. Any nation can choose to be strategic about where they invest their resources. They can choose to innovate and adapt rather than cling to the past. They can choose to focus on making their own nation stronger rather than trying to dominate everywhere at once. This is what separates nations that maintain their power from nations that decline. It's not about how much power you have. It's about making smart strategic choices about how you use that power. If you enjoyed this breakdown of how superpowers decline, you need to watch our next video, where we analyze the specific